Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a great talk so far. And what I want to focus on is the sweet spot, right? The stress sweet spot. What we're going to argue is that stress can definitely be a good thing, but we want to find a level that actually promotes student growth, that promotes their learning, but doesn't overwhelm them as well. And luckily, I have some recent stats actually that back up some of the arguments as far as why we should care about student stress levels. So as far as a recent study from SFU students, over 1,000 SFU students were asked what were the factors that affect their academic performance, and the number one thing that came up was stress. So 44% of students said that. I put this up in my class last week when we were talking about mental health. I teach health sometimes, and everyone in the class pretty much agreed with this, and I think if you remember back to your own university experience, this isn't surprising. What's interesting about this as well is you see that anxiety, sleep difficulties, work, internet use, and depression are all in there as well, and it seems like these can be all linked as well. Okay. As far as the stress levels that SFU students feel that they experience, and this is as far as the past 12 months go, more than 50% of students, if you just look at the purple and the blue, more than 50% of SFU students felt that they experienced more than average to tremendous stress. And especially it's the tremendous ones that I'm worried about. Right? I think we all remember being university students. Some people in this room are, and it's a stressful time, but we don't want to make it overwhelmingly stressful, right? And I'd also argue that I want to eliminate that blue at the bottom as well, that no stress category. I don't know who that was, but I don't know, another mythical creature there, the no stress university student. And as far as how that stress affects performance, well, a lot of students, as I think a lot of us understand as well, feel very overwhelmed by all they had to do. And what's interesting from this is that, and not surprising to me either, that this was a little bit more so in females versus the male population, that they felt overwhelmed, and that kind of speaks to the fact that they're not just doing their studies, right? A lot of these students are working either part-time or full-time in some cases. There's relationship difficulties, there's sleep difficulties, there's a lot of social pressures out there, it's a lot. So I am not here to argue that we need to eliminate stress from students' lives, and that's not what I argue in my health class as well. What I want to argue is that there's that sweet spot, right? Where it's not too much and not too little, right? So that little amount of stress, those no stress, that mythical side of things, we don't want that because then there's not adaptation, there's not growth, right? We need to push ourselves. I teach in BPK, so in kinesiology we talk about, training our muscles. And our muscles don't get any stronger, they don't adapt unless we challenge them. But if we target them too much, then they're overstressed and they can start to have damage in them as well. So we want to find the sweet spot, right? Where there's not too much stress and not too little stress. And we can do this without the expense of what we're communicating to students as well, as far as the actual workload goes. There's a difference between the perceived workload that students feel and the actual workload as well. So I don't want to necessarily change actual workload, although maybe in some cases we have to do that and try to figure out what's the realistic amount of information to teach our students, but more focus on perceived workload. So how do we make the learning environment more facilitating where we are promoting growth without overstressing our students? Okay, so I guess my kind of three-step suggestion for finding this sweet spot of stress is to remove barriers, right? So to try to minimize unnecessary stressors, and I'll go into what I believe some of those to be. I think it's really important for us to set an example as well. We're, as educators, we have a lot of things, a lot of balls to juggle, and students feel that a lot of times, right? Where there's something called stress contagion that is sometimes spoken about, and we want to, set a good example for students. And then, and this is actually kind of related to point one as well, to provide those necessary tools to succeed as well. And this is actually a nice jump off from those last two talks, so I'll kind of employ some of the things that they talked about as well. right? So minimize unnecessary stressors. And I think one of the good ways to do that is to be proactive, to be very clear in expectations as much as possible. You know, we had an undergraduate student in our department meeting the other week, and we were starting to talk about mental health issues. And she pulled me aside afterwards and she said, you know, I really want to talk to you about this because some professors really, they add unnecessary stress where there doesn't need to be. Right? There could be two courses or one course taught by two different people, same material, but one has a lot more stress than the others. And part of that is in the communication we have with students, right? And how proactive we are. And the good thing about being proactive is that it sometimes lessens the amount of work we have to do. Right? If you're just being reactive, and I always like to do that, and if you're just being reactive and answering emails as they come up, right? You're not sending the same message to everyone, right? And you're not kind of setting that foundation of clarity as well. Why I have that picture up there, does anyone know what that picture is from? From the snow closure. You know, we didn't have a lot of control over that as educators, but I know that created a lot of stress amongst students. And I think part of the problem was that they didn't know what was going on. It's a stressful time, it's exam period, and then there's all this uncertainty as well. Right? So I'll share my story. I had an exam at 8:30 the day after it was supposed to hit. Right? So the day before it was supposed to hit, the big one, I got so many different emails from students frantically, what do we do? What do we do? You know, I don't know. And I didn't know because I didn't know if it was going to be canceled or whatnot, but I knew if I was getting a few emails about this, everyone was kind of feeling the same way. So I just sent out an email saying, listen, I don't know. We're going to go ahead and say that the exam's going to happen. The university will tell you at 6 a.m. if it's not. I will send you an email at 6 a.m. if it's not, right? And then we'll go from there. And if it is rescheduled, we'll go from there. But just to be clear about those things. And this is something that's come up as well as promoting this safe classroom environment. So I liked, I totally forget the first speaker, his name, but pardon me? What Carl said about, you know, if you have a policy about disabilities or inclusivity, to really be explicit with that. And to not just promote a physical safe space, you know, where the lighting is good and the room is organized in a good way, but also a psychological safe space as well. You know, I teach about nutrition and health, and I teach about mental health as well, and some of these issues are very touchy, right? Especially when it comes to mental health. Right? So one of the ways you can promote a safe space is by talking about your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing that, right? Within reason. Or just, you know, being clear about the fact that, you know, there's different people in the room and that we all have different experiences, and it's okay to have, you know, these other experiences as well. Number 2 is set an example. So like I really believe a lot in self-care, and we need to take care of ourselves as well because the students feel it when we are stressed out. Right? So setting examples, so one thing we can do is talk about our own experiences. I like to talk about my experiences as an undergrad, right? And how I, you know, like I was a good student in high school and then first few years of university, you know, and it took a while to get a little bit, you know, feel a little bit more confident, but sharing that with students kind of makes it a little bit more compassionate, I believe, right? Talking about your own experiences, learning a topic. You know, I talk about cellular respiration and how when I first learned that equation, I was like, why the heck do I need to know this, right? And then it kind of shows that we struggle with this too and that we're human, right? And we're all part of this, you know, human interaction. Encourage interest through enthusiasm and relevance. In that first study that I kind of talked about a perceived workload, they said one of the things that, you know, causes students to have a perception that the workload isn't so much as if they like the subject, which seems pretty obvious, right? And how do you make them like it? Well, part of it is enthusiasm. You know, a good teacher can make pretty much, you know, rocks be enthusiastic, right? And geologists in the room might agree, right? They can make anything interesting. And showing your own interest in something, right? Being enthusiastic about something, it's really contagious and it makes the environment more interesting. And promoting relevance as well. When are you going to use this? You know, I didn't think I needed to know calculus, and then, well, I never used it again, but, sorry, you know, but it's important if you're going on to economics, right? It's important if you're going on into these other areas, show where it might be useful or worthwhile knowing. And then I have this study up on the side. This is a recent UBC study where they went into elementary schools and they, you know, asked teachers their level of burnout, right? They did assessment of burnout on the teacher, and then they compared that with cortisol levels in the students. And cortisol is one of the markers for stress. So they found in the teachers that had self-reported burnout, the students had higher cortisol levels, right? Which I don't think it wasn't unsurprising, but it's an interesting study, right? So, you know, how we express ourselves and how we show ourselves to student, it is contagious, and it can, you know, we can set a better example. And I think, again, self-care and being aware of when you're stressed out and when you need a timeout as well, right? Or to do something that's good for you, that's also important. And have and encourage self-compassion. This comes out of another recent UBC study, that one of the main things that predicted well-being in first year was student self-compassion, right? Where, you know, there's other ways to assess success in a class, and that, you know, grades are important, but so is learning outcomes, and what do you get out of it, and how can you apply it to things, right? And maybe your first year doesn't go so well, but there's lots of opportunities to make this up, right? And maybe this course isn't going well, economics isn't going well, but maybe that's because you're supposed to be in BPK instead, right? So, and to encourage that self-compassion, I think that's really important for us as well, okay? And then this kind of speaks to the first one as well, you know, provide the necessary tools for success. Try not to schedule everything together. So this is an example of one of my course outlines for, what's this one? This is for my health class. It's an interesting class. You're welcome to audit it if you'd like. But try not to group everything together if you can. You know, I know at the beginning of the semester we spend time building our courses, right? Think about when assessments are and try to break them up as much as possible. Be clear on when these things are going to be. Speaking of assessments, I went through the distance education schedule, and I tried to find out which weeks, because I couldn't do it for the whole university, but I was interested to see when all the exams were scheduled. And as far as just the distance education courses, almost all exams were scheduled in weeks 6 to 7, which admittedly is when I schedule my exams as well, right? So we need to be conscious of when, you know, students are in their, you know, that distress, that bad side of that curve. And I don't know, I might change my assessment schedule accordingly, we'll see. Right? And then again, course clarity with things like rubrics, very clear assessment guidelines, right? Talk about why we're doing it. I make students do, they have to read a journal article. I don't know how many of them actually read it in first year, but they have to read a journal article and provide a brief summary of it. But I'm basically telling them, I'm making you do this because this is what a scientist does, because this is where we go to find out good information. Right? Because there's lots of bad information out there, and I want you guys to have the tools to know it, right? To give them reasons why you're doing it, I think makes it a little bit more clear, right? And again, just as much as you can, minimize the uncertainty whenever it comes up, you know, and by being proactive, sending out emails. If I get more than 3 emails about the same thing, I'll send out a class email, right? Maybe 4, it kind of depends. Right? But if I keep getting the same questions, I don't want to keep answering the same questions. So I think if a few people have it, everyone has it. And you can just post things on Canvas as well, announcements on Canvas, have everything laid out, right? And I'm not saying that we're eliminating workload. I still, you know, want our students to learn the skills and the knowledge that we're providing them with, but we can do that in an environment that promotes adaptation, right? And not overstress. Okay, cool. That was stressful.